Yeah, I think one of the best ways that I've heard to conceptualize the ego, to think about what the ego is, think of it as if it's your inner storyteller. It's generating your story. It's telling the narrative of your life. And it's creating through that story your identity. Who you believe yourself to be comes largely through the ego. It's important to note, though, that the ego is just one part of our consciousness, and it places us as a character in a story, which is in a way the first step to sort of losing control over our story, and in that we don't know necessarily subconsciously how that story is being written until we're willing to do the work and look back on it. You know, the ego shapes our perceptions, it shapes our emotion, it shapes our reaction to the world around us. I think it's just a useful concept to start to talk about gaining self-control in our life, which I imagine that's why you're here. That's why I'm here. So the ego constantly comments on our actions and the actions of others. It's evaluating, it's comparing, it's judging. Now, most importantly, the ego actually uses our past experiences to assume what's coming next. Our ego keeps us safe. It helps us navigate this crazy world. It helps us get what we want in a socially acceptable way. It mediates between the inner and outer world, but it does so by making us a character in a story. As an example, it's not uncommon, let's say, to suffer some form of injury, and then whatever activity, whatever person, whatever circumstances led to that injury, that you would then avoid that person. That's a real simple example of how the ego takes information in and goes, whoa, that part of the world is scary. We don't need to go over there. That could be for the better, right? The ego's job is to keep us alive, but it could be for the worse in that, okay, we suffered, we had an injury, we recovered. Should we shut that part of our life out, whether that's some form of physical exercise, that's, taking on some new challenge that could be helpful or hurtful to us in the short term, but beneficial in the long run. Anyway, you can see how the ego formulates a story, places us in it, and says, we need to keep this guy safe. The things that we don't like, the things that seem to work against us, get away from them, get away from them. So let's ask ourselves, why don't you ask yourself right now, what story has your ego written for you? Quite often the ego writes a story about struggle, about insecurities, about ways in which we have lost control and are now seeking to get it back, or ways in which we desire validation, right? Acceptance from other people. The ego's primary task in our mind is to keep us alive. So to do that, it emphasizes negative information for our attention, right? It's like, look at that, look at that, look at that. That could hurt you, that could hurt you, that could hurt you. Stay away from that. It looks at past experiences as an indicator of what's to come, right? If you royally screwed up a presentation at school or at work, public speaking might become a real problem for you if you failed at it once before. But you could see then what it would look like to rewire this part of our life and say, okay, I failed here at public speaking. Can I go back to the drawing board and can I try it again? That would require a healthy ego. That would require maybe getting some criticism from outside, watching your presentation back on video, God forbid. As well, our ego builds our identity based on what we've done and what we have. That's why we're so, at times, if we have a runaway ego or an unhealthy ego, we can be resistant to change, resistance to starting something new. It's like, well, I'm very good and I'm very comfortable where I'm at now. To go somewhere else and try something new would require pain and shame and humiliation and failure and a lack of knowledge. I don't want to do that, so I resist that. And we're also very resistant to giving things up sometimes, right? Doing away with bad habits, doing away with the comfort of our current life. That's the ego at play, keeping us alive, keeping us centered, keeping us in that story where this is who I am, this is what I do. We don't change too much because outside of these boundaries is pain. Our ego seeks to keep us from vulnerability. It will worry us to no end with overthinking. Should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do this? And it really can have us believing that who we were in the past and who we are right now is who we shall forever be. And we've got to keep that identity locked. Okay, so now that we have a sense of what the ego is doing for us and in our mind, for better or for worse, and we should say, in some sense, there are benefits to having a healthy ego, right? One that can take in criticism, one that can be vigilant about what's going on around us. But when that tends into a fear of criticism, a hypervigilance where everything is a threat, that's an indication of an unhealthy ego. Now that we're starting to get a sense of how the ego works, let's look at some signs and symptoms that it might be time to deal with your ego heal your ego, and form a partnership with your ego. This is what I did. So, or at least it's what I'm doing. I'm no great guru who's reached the end. I'm just a few steps down the road.